Good morning, everyone. Oh, wow, that's loud. Okay. Good morning. Hi. My name is Nicolette. I am one of the grief counselors with Lightways Hospice and Serious Illness Care. I am just so grateful to be here with you all. Like I said, I'm one of the grief counselors. I've been with Lightways coming up now on 6 years doing grief counseling. So I work primarily with our hospice families after their loved one has died, just providing that comfort and support to really understand their grief journey and kind of process all of the layers of their grief. I also work with community members as well. So we're able to provide grief counseling to anyone in the community who has experienced the loss of a loved one. But what brings me here today is I've also worked with family members who are processing the decline of their loved one. So I've worked with people to provide pre-bereavement. And that's kind of my hope here today is to really explore this idea of what anticipatory grief is. I love talking about grief, which I know sounds really strange. But I am a firm believer that grief is a universal experience. Every single person in this room will experience grief at some point. I actually read somewhere someone had said there's a way that you could go your whole life without experiencing grief. You just can't love anything or anyone. Right? Because grief is the price we pay for love. So I love talking about this universal experience and just how it differs between each of us. Now, that being said, I love to talk, but I also really love to listen because I'm a counselor. That's my role. So I kind of love that it's this kind of small, quaint group. And I encourage you all to please, if you have any insights, any questions, any thoughts of, yeah, I totally relate to that, or that is not my experience at all, I'd love to hear it. No pressure to talk, but I don't want you to feel like you have to just sit quietly. Hopefully, there will also be some time at the end where I can answer any questions. And I'll also just be sticking around if anyone just needs some more quiet space to kind of process some things. So, like I said, my hope today is to really have us explore what this idea of anticipatory grief is. And I'm just going to say grief from now on, if you're okay with that, because it's a tongue twister to say anticipatory. And I don't think we all want to take tabs on every single time I say anticipatory. Um, but I want to talk about what it is. I think there are some myths like when does anticipatory grief start? When does it become regular grief? How is it different? How is it the same? I can't tell you how many times people will come into my office and tell me, I feel like I'm going crazy. They'll say that exact phrase. I feel like I'm going crazy. I feel like I'm doing this wrong because I'm crying too much. Or I feel like I'm doing this wrong because I'm not crying enough. I feel like I'm doing this wrong because I actually laughed today. And that is a no no with what I'm going through. And so a lot of what I do is really help normalize what they're experiencing. So I want to talk about just that. What are the common reactions? What are the common responses? How do we get through this journey? And how does my journey look similar to your journey, but also look really different than your journey? And then when we go through that, I want to get to what do we do with all of this, right? We're left with all of these conflicting emotions that leave us with this internal tornado inside of us. So, how do we cope? How do we show ourselves compassion and kindness and grace through this journey? And then finally, at the end, I just want to touch a little bit on how we can support our kiddos and our teens. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but really there's this idea, especially with our kiddos, that we have to put on this brave face. We have to put on the suit and armor and be strong and kind of plow through and let them see that we are strength and mom and dad has got this. And I get that. But also I hope you leave today kind of understanding that strength in grief is actually leaning into it. That's what strength is. It's allowing yourself to be present in the grief and really feel the emotions. And one of the healthiest things you can do for your family is to model healthy grief, which is allowing yourself to express it. But again, we'll get into that a little bit later. And I have some resources as well at the end if anyone kind of wants to learn more about that. So, what is anticipatory grief? It's this whole experience of the emotions, the behaviors, the reactions that we experience during this impending loss. And it's filled with so many complicated emotions. And part of that is that we're often finding ourselves in this in between place of holding on to hope, but also letting go. And how do you do both of that at the same time? Oftentimes, people who are going through this grief journey will feel intensified anger. They'll feel an increase of a loss of control. right? It's grieving before your loved one has died and grieving with each little step that happens in their medical journey, whether it's a decline or a progression. Grieving with what does this mean now for my loved one? What does this mean now for me? And how do we cope with this new normal, this new reality that we're in this moment right here? And it can be really hard. Um, there's a lot of stress that we often feel as caregivers, which is a beautiful honor that we are happy to hold and we feel honored to hold, but it's exhausting. And you're trying to manage what little energy you have as a caregiver and giving that to our loved one. So it's filled with, like I said, so many emotions. But I want to talk about some big ones that I often see. Now, I could probably spend a whole 4 hours talking about all of the emotions we experience, but I won't do that for you all today. I'm just going to talk about 4 or 5 of these big ones and really how we see them play out in our grief journey. And a lot of these emotions that you'll see up here, um, sometimes we feel a little shame or embarrassed for feeling, or we tell ourselves we shouldn't be feeling these things, or we get the message from other people that we shouldn't be feeling these things, whether it's said verbally or just the way that they behave. So I think it's really important to understand the reason why we feel these emotions. I'm a firm believer that we don't just experience emotions to experience them for the heck of it. There's a purpose. We feel for a reason and we behave for a reason. And we have to understand why our body is giving us these sensations. So we're going to jump right in there. Let's start with denial. Um, Denial gets a bad reputation, right? We often hear you can't live in denial. You need to accept the reality. You're going to live with guilt if you don't accept what's happening right now. You can't push it away in the corner. Okay. But I'm going to be honest with you. I kind of don't buy into that. I really think that denial is actually a very important and necessary emotion that we experience in the grief journey. And I really want you to think about how denial protects us. So there's this quote we have up here: we cannot look at the sun all of the time. And there's another quote that I want to leave with you as well, in that denial is the heart's way of only letting in as much as we can handle. And I think when we look at it from that standpoint, we're able to understand denial is kind of a survival technique. It buffers these extreme emotions we are experiencing in and day out. I'm sure you can all have heard that phrase, when I heard the news, my heart stopped. When I heard the news, I almost fainted. Right? When we have these shocking news, our body kind of goes into a shock and it makes that instinctive decision: how am I going to survive this? And sometimes the way it does that is it just pulls the shade down. So denial helps us protect ourselves. I want you to imagine, when you were a little kid, maybe, and you were going to sleep at night and you were afraid the monster was going to get you. What's one thing that we would do? We would take the covers and pull them over our head, right? Because if I can't see the monsters can't see me. I'm protected. Not totally logical, but we felt it, right? And so that's what denial does for us. It lets us pull up the covers temporarily and protect us. And sometimes I think the stigma or the fear with denial is that if I am not fully present in it, will I feel guilt on the line? But also, if I were to fully be aware of what's going on, sometimes there's the fear of, will they think I've given up on them? If I say the word, you're dying, or if I have the understanding I'm going to die, does it mean that I've given up? Does it mean that I'm bowing down to this illness? Sometimes there's even a fear of, will it quicken the death? If my loved one thinks that I've given up on them, will they just give up? And the reality is that, a lot of research actually has not supported that and found that actually it creates those opportunities to have those discussions of the fears and having better education to understand those fears and kind of debunk some of those monsters. But like I said, it buffers us when we need that buffer. So when you're thinking about denial, I really want you to remember that it protects us. And that's really the purpose of this emotion. It also helps us feel normal sometimes. And that's a really relative word because normal can change moment to moment with our illnesses. And when we're experiencing a serious illness, what feels normal right now might totally change the next moment. So when we pull that cover up, it kind of lets us pause time for a little bit and just be in the now with what we're experiencing. So remember, I just want you to remember it's not a steady state, it's a state of denial. And the goal is to kind of plant seeds every once in a while, which is what our staff is amazing at Lightways is our social workers will really help work with patients and their families to kind of plant seeds of education. I'm hearing that it's, that you're hopeful that treatment will work and you're hopeful that we'll get 5 more years. Okay, if you get 5 more years, what are we hoping to accomplish? What are you hoping to accomplish in the next year? What's our goal for the next 6 months? So phrasing it in ways like that of like, yes, I understand we're hopeful. So let's just focus on the next 6 months. Let's just focus on the next month. What is the next month going to look like in this 5 year plan? And it helps, like I said, kind of plant the seeds. Because we have to remember if we're trying to kind of strip someone from their denial, we're stripping them from that blanket that's protecting them. And oftentimes, people with a serious illness or who are experiencing, like I said, just a serious illness and are on progression for decline, asking them to fully be aware might just be too petrifying. Sometimes that denial gives our loved ones a fighting chance. The sense of, I'm going to keep fighting, I'm going to keep pushing, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to keep going. So we have to respect that, even though we may have thoughts of where we think they should be. So let's move on to anger. Anger is another tough one that I think we always hear can't hold on to anger. Anger is bad. Anger is unhealthy. Anger will eat you away. It's not a good thing. And again, I don't know if I buy into that. Anger in itself is actually a really healthy emotion and it's a necessary emotion. And the phrase I want you to think of is it's a call to arms, right? It's that red flag. It's the flag on the field. Is that the phrase? I'm bad at sports, but that phrase, right? Of like, hold on, pause, something wrong has happened. We need to look at what's just happened here and make sure there wasn't a penalty, make sure there wasn't a wrongdoing. And anger allows us to both protect ourselves and our loved ones. So, when we're working with a hospice family, there might be a family member who is just on the outside might look like they're just complaining about every little thing. Man, the sheet was too cold. The food wasn't right. We arrived 10 minutes late. Now we showed up 20 minutes early. They're just complaining. But when we really take a step back and look at it, this family is living in a state where everything is out of their control, down to their loved one's health. Everything they're doing to try and grasp on is just slipping from their fingers. So their natural reaction is to try and grasp onto the things that are in their control, like when we show up, how warm the sheet might be. So we have to understand that anger is a surface level for something deeper, perhaps. Like I said, it encourages us to protect our loved ones, to advocate for them, but also sometimes to protect ourselves. I don't know how you all feel about this, but sometimes I think anger feels less vulnerable than sadness sometimes. I'm a counselor. My whole job is talking about my feelings and my emotions and creating safe space to not be apologetic. That being said, I can't tell you how many times I've confided in a friend about something really stressful, shed a few tears, and the first thing I've said is, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I'm crying. I'm so sorry. We feel like we have to apologize for this vulnerable experience. Now, if I'm mad at someone, I can't really remember a time where I've said, I'm so sorry that I'm angry at you right now. That just doesn't happen, right? Anger sometimes feels like it's more in our control. Something makes me sad versus I am angry at you. And again, when someone is dealing with everything feeling out of their control, if anger is one thing I can hold on to and I can control, I'm going to use that as often and as much as I can. Also, the one thing I wanted to point out is that sometimes anger is just the spill out of all of the other emotions that we're feeling. We're going through this process of taking care of our loved one or processing our own serious illness, and we're filled with so many conflicting emotions: anger, guilt, frustration, sadness, confusion, helplessness, all of the things. And it drains our energy that we would normally be able to use to self soothe ourselves. Normally if something kind of bumps me up to 5 or 6 on my Richter scale, I'm able to calm myself down. I'm able to rationalize. I'm able to see that other person's point of view and really be understanding. But that takes energy to do. So if I'm working on empty fuel, I don't have the energy to try and see your point of view. I don't have the energy to try and calm myself down and soothe myself. So it surfaces as anger. So what I always encourage people to remember is if you're seeing someone who is just angry about every little thing, step aside and really think, okay, what's going on for this person's experience right now? Is it really about the fact that the coffee cup spilled? Probably not. That's probably the straw that broke the camel's back. But what else is going on in that person's life? And same with our own anger. If we're finding that we are just constantly irritable, every little thing is setting us off, we need to pause and reflect, okay, what's going on here? Is this really about this or is there something else going on? And give ourselves the compassion to understand anger just feels safer to feel right now. Now, it doesn't mean I'm giving you permission to just scream at everyone and kick and punch things, but I think the first step is to acknowledge where that's coming from to show yourself a little bit more compassion. So we said denial serves to protect us. Anger also serves to protect us. The next one we're going to talk about is fear. If you had to take a wild guess, what do you think fear does for us? It protects us, right? Let's look at it from even just an evolutionary standpoint. If I'm in the jungle late at night and I look into the forest and I see two glowing eyes looking at me, is my instinct to run towards that or run away from those glowing eyes? 9 times out of 10, my instinct would be get the heck out of there and run away, right? And that's from an evolutionary standpoint. Fear helps us survive. It helps us assess danger, come up with our plan, and survive the natural threat. And that's what fear does for us in the grief journey. It helps us signal the unknown. It helps us signal the different. It helps us signal the potential danger. And then from that, we're able to pause, stop, think, come up with the plan to help us survive this potential threat. It kind of puts this scope vision on almost where we really hyper analyze this one potential threat and think, what are all the different avenues? How am I going to help prevent this fear or face this fear? Those going through anticipatory grief might often feel hyper alert. So this sense of like everything is a red flag, the fear of like I'm afraid to even glance around the corner because I don't know what's there, but also I have this really big instinct to want to look so I can prepare myself. And the tricky thing with anticipatory grief and grief in general is that we can't always prepare for what's around that corner as much as we try. There are just some things that are going to be completely out of our control. So what do we do with all of this then? How do we manage the fear that we're having? I'm going to ask you to face it. I know that's really, really scary because, again, our instinct tells us push it in a corner, keep it away, keep it over here. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to look at it. Um, but the truth is that there is something really powerful about confronting the fear and saying the fear out loud. There's something really powerful about this idea that our fears inside of our head um, can almost appear to be this like monster that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And every time we run away from it, all we're doing is adding one more inch to that monster and the size of it. Instead, what we need to do is really identify what the fears are and have those conversations out loud and take away the power from that monster. So I have a couple examples of this with families that I've worked with, and let me just kind of state for the record, I'm not saying any identifying information. I'm going to keep things very simple, basic, surface level. But I was working with a patient or client for pre-bereavement, and her loved one was on our services, her partner, and we were talking about all the different roles that her loved one has played in her life. And he was the jokester. He was her emotional support blanket. He was her rock. He was her sounding board. He's all of these things. He also was just like the logistical person. So when the heater broke, he knew who to call. He had it on his calendar when the dog needed their heartworm medication. He knew what the plumber's number was. He knew how to pay the bills and all the passwords and how to go online and make an inquiry and all of those things. So I'm talking with my client. She's like, Nicolette, this is going to sound really minuscule and like probably really silly because my husband's going through so many bigger things right now, but I'm petrified of having to emotionally process the loss of him. And then on top of that, I'm going to have to manage everything. I'm so afraid of what the world is going to look like without him, and that everything is going to be on my shoulders. It's going to be one more thing that I'm going to have to do, but there's no way I can tell him that. He's dying. Like, that is so out of the radar of what he needs to be worried about me. So we went back and forth, and I at the end of the conversation, we came up with a plan of how she was going to approach this to him, because she said, "This is really bothering me, and I don't want it to be something that I didn't address with him as he kind of progresses." Come to find out, her partner was having the same exact fear. And his fear was, I've protected you my whole life. I love you. And I know that you're going to be able to handle this, but I am so afraid of not being able to protect you. I'm so afraid that I'm not going to be there for you anymore. And it petrifies me. So what they did is they sat down with a piece of paper, and he went through all of the things. This is who you call for the plumber. This is when the dog needs their heartworm medication. This is where I buy the filters. This is the password to pay our bill. This is how you go online and pay the bill. Wrote down all of the things. And at the end of the conversation, they both felt a lot of peace and relief. And his thought was also, I wanted to bring this up to you, but I figured, why would I even bring that up? That's not what you're going to be worried about. Like, who cares? I'm not going to be here. You're not going to worry if I'm worried about not protecting you. But there was this elephant in the room that both of them were not wanting to talk about. And when they actually both did, they felt a lot of relief. And so she was scared to bring it up, scared to say it out loud, but it took away some of the power when she did. Now, I'm not saying it took away all of her grief by any means, but it was one little piece that she could kind of check off and say, okay, I'm going to put this piece of paper in a safe place. And worst case scenario, even if I'm struggling, I can hand this piece of paper to one of my support people and they can call the person for me. But I have a plan in place. And that's really what, addressing these fears and talking about them can be really helpful. So I have up here some of the common fears that people will face at the end of life. And I'm not going to talk about all of them. There are a few that I want to talk about, though. The pain and discomfort, that's obviously a very big one. I think that's a really common fear that both our patients and their loved ones experience. And again, what's really not great about this one, but what's helpful about this one is that education can really help ease some pain. So that's when our hospice team steps in and provides a lot of education regarding how to give medication. I mean, that in itself is a big fear, I think, for a lot of our family members, because we're not nurse trained. And I'll be honest, even those of us who are nurses, all that goes out the window when it's your own family member. You have no logic. It's just you are purely on emotion and heart. So, education about how to provide morphine, for example, helping debunk the myths that morphine is going to quicken the death, that you're going to overdose your loved one, helping them understand what pain looks like in someone who is terminal. That in itself can be very scary, because we know as we reach end of life, for example, there are some natural processes that happen with the body that can look kind of scary for people seeing it, but the loved one themselves is actually not experiencing any pain. And so, prior to my work with hospice, my grandfather was on hospice, and I actually remember seeing these things in the hospital and thinking, "Oh my God, what is happening? My loved one is suffering. What is going on?" And it wasn't until the social worker came in and said, "Okay, this is actually called terminal agitation. We call this the death rattle, and it sounds very scary, but I promise you, your loved one is not experiencing any pain." And it really helped kind of soothe that. But again, even in that moment, I'm thinking, I can't say this. I'm probably going to sound like a nut job talking about, are you killing my grandfather? But you had to call it out. So education can be really helpful for that one. Another one that we often see is for the caregiver, the fear of making a wrong decision, a wrong choice. As a caregiver, we have such an honor, like I said, to take care of our loved one and at the end of the day, make decisions for them as they lose the capacity to. And it's an honor, but it's a heavy weight. So, with this fear, especially, I always encourage people, if possible, to start having those conversations about advanced directives now. And so, an example of this, and again, I'm keeping it very simple, so no identified information. I was working with a family or a person after their loved one had died. And she had told me that before her loved one really started to decline, she had a conversation with her and she said, "Okay, the goal is to stay at home. We're going to keep you at home as long as we can. What do you want the room to look like? Like, what do you want to be feeling? How do you want this to be for you? And she had said, I want this specific album to be playing in the background. And it seems so minuscule, right? Like a song playing. Um, but that was really important to her. And she said, I want to know that, like, as I'm taking my final breaths, this is a song that's playing. And this is a song that you all will be able to remember me by. And so for my client, this brought her a lot of peace, knowing this was one wish that she could grant for her loved one. It was one thing that was in her control to be able to say, I know she wants this done. And there was no thought of, did I do it right? Is this what she wanted? But it was a conversation they had kind of prior to these steps. And so here we come into the conundrum of, if someone is really experiencing denial to protect themselves, how do you have these conversations? Right? If I come up and say, well, you probably only have 2 weeks to live. So what do you want to do here? I would never say that. But if I did say that, can you imagine the response that person would give me? Instead, we have to really kind of be soft about these questions of, like, I totally understand there's that hope that we're going to last 5 years. And I have that hope too. So just down the line, if anything were to change, let's say something were to change and we no longer have that hope, what can I do to help make sure that your wishes are the way they need to be? So like I said, I always encourage people just to kind of have those conversations now. There is always that concern of, I don't want to be a burden to my family. I don't want to add more stress to them than they already are experiencing. There's the concern of just losing their autonomy and losing their control and dignity. I mean, I think any human being, that's a challenge for us to feel like we're losing our autonomy. And so with that, it's really discussing with your loved one who has a serious illness, what are the things that they do have in their control? Like what I was just saying, where she said, I wanted the music played. That was one thing that she could have in her control. And that gave her that sense of peace. And this is just the big one, the unknown. And that's a scary one, because that's a question we may not be able to get an answer to. That's like saying, I need you to predict what's around the corner. And sometimes we can't do that. Another one that I want to mention too, that is often a fear, is the fear of being forgotten. When I leave this earth, I don't want the world to forget me. And more so, I really hear this with caregivers and family members. I just don't want the world to forget how amazing they are. And so often early in the grief journey, we're kind of given that permission to share stories, talk about our emotions, talk about them. And then we kind of reach what we call the expiration date of our grief. And I'm putting air quotes up because it's non existent. There is no expiration date to this. But we stop being given that permission to really talk about our grief. And we kind of feel that pressure to not bring them up. And so this is a fear that people really start even before their loved one has taken their final breaths of, what am I going to do to make sure they're never forgotten? So what we like to encourage people to think about is something called a legacy project. Has anyone here heard of a legacy project? Yeah. So really what a legacy project is it gives your loved one an opportunity to stay with you, even after their final moments here, to continue having their spirit with you. On our hospice team, so each of our patients is given a whole team of providers. They're given a chaplain, a social worker, a nurse, a CNA, and then they're also given something called complementary therapies as an option. So one of the complementary therapists is a music therapist. And we have phenomenal music therapists. They're just so talented, not only musically, but they're so talented empathically, of like really connecting with the patients, helping ease heart rates, helping with the agitation, and helping open doors of conversations with family members and the patient through the use of music. So what our music therapists have been able to do is they're able to do something called a heartbeat song. And what they do is they record the patient's heartbeat and they use it as the beat to a song. And then they record a song and they're able to save it digitally and give it to the family members. So it's a way to take that person's literal heartbeat and keep it with them for the rest of their life. And it could be a song that reminds them of their loved one. It could be a song that maybe their loved one wanted to make sure they were reminded of, whatever it might be. But it's a way to kind of hold those two pieces together. Also, if that seems a little too kind of high access for you, you could do any type of art And I'm not saying you need to sit down with a pile of clay and build a sculpture. That's your forte. Go for it. All for it. But it could be something as simple as making a scrapbook. Sitting down with your loved one, sharing pictures, sharing memories, reminiscing, and doing something together that then you're going to be left with something tangible. We've also had people, like patients, write a letter to their loved one or leave a video message for their loved one that they play after they're gone as kind of a way to just say those final messages to them. But again, these are conversations, if you find a theme here, that we need to have kind of early on and start just planting those seeds of what would be helpful for you and for me as the caregiver. Any questions about any of that? I have more resources. If anyone wants to learn more about legacy projects, just come find me and I can always send you things. So we've talked about three of the emotions, because I think fear and guilt kind of go hand in hand. But the last one I want to talk about is sadness. Now, if we were playing Family Feud and the question on the board said, name an emotion that someone experiences in grief, that top answer is probably going to be sadness, right? Like if you think of someone grieving, that is the number one emotion people are going to say they probably experience. And the difficult part about feeling sadness is that you're in this place of, my loved one is still here, they're breathing. I should be focused on spending the time with them, being present with them, appreciating the time I have with them, being grateful. So why am I so sad? Why is it so hard for me to be present with them right now? And the reason for that is you're grieving right now. You're already grieving, even though their heart is still beating. With each decline, each step in their decline, you're faced with a whole new wave of emotions: fear, anger, sadness, guilt. What does the normal look like now? And then another decline happens, and you're hit with it all over again. And you're constantly being hit left and right. And so I think our inclination or our instinct is to just shove it down to our toes, like I said, right? Because why would we want to feel this pain? We already have so many things we're managing right now. Sitting with this pain is just not on my to-do list. I'm going to push it down to my toes. And sometimes we do have to do that. If I'm in line at the grocery store and I see a candy bar that reminds me of my loved one, is that the most opportune moment to break down? Probably not. So we tell ourselves, shove it down to your toes, distract yourself, do something else. And that's okay if we have to do that. But we have to pull it back up eventually, because otherwise it just sits in our toes. And then eventually we can only shove things down to our knees, and then only our shoulders, then here, and then there's no more room to shove things. And that's when everything explodes. That's when me stubbing my toe on the chair all of a sudden means I'm on the floor in the fetal position going, why is this my life? And it has nothing to do with the chair. It's just the explosion of emotions. So I completely understand that instinct to shove it down. But what I hope you can leave here today understanding is, when you have that instinct to shove it, even more so in that moment, you have to give yourself permission to lean into it. That means there's something internally signaling you need to feel what's happening here. And we also have to understand that there are so many emotions we're going to experience in here. I mean, so many that I can't even fit them, the whole picture on the screen, because there's just so many. And this isn't even all of them. And so I think this can be freeing to understand there isn't a way that I have to get through this. There isn't a way that I'm supposed to be feeling. But it also can be really frustrating, because I will have people ask me or tell me, like, just tell me what I need to do. I just need like a checklist. Like, what's the recipe I need to do? How do I get through this? At what point, at what day will I start to feel better? And I have to be the bearer of bad news and say, I don't have that answer. I wish I had that magical recipe. If I did, I'd be a billionaire. I'm here, obviously. I love this work, but if I was a billionaire, I might not be here. So clearly there isn't a way to do this. And it can be frustrating to not be able to grasp on how to get through this. That being said, what do we do with it all, right? What are some options that we can do to really show ourselves the grace, to show ourselves the compassion that we need to have the longevity to continue through this grief journey? So I have two lines up here. The first one is the intensity of grief, and the line underneath that is our ability to cope with the grief. Now, there's a couple differences between these two lines. The top one is really out of our control, right? We might think we're kind of averaging on a 4 or 5 on the intensity of where our grief is. And then we get a call from a doctor that has bad news, bumps us up to an 8 or 9. Then we're able to use some coping skills, kind of work ourselves back down to a 3 or 4, and then we get another trigger. And it's constantly bouncing back and forth and completely out of our control. We have no say so on when it bumps up or when it bumps down. The number line underneath is our ability to cope. So those are using the skills, our tools to help us manage these emotions. And the goal of this is we want to increase this bottom line to help decrease that top line. That's our goal. Now, as we know, grief is out of our control in a lot of ways. So as much as we try to increase this, something could change in a second and decrease our ability and increase the intensity. But overall, our goal is to find ways to help increase that number. So there's a lot of things that you can do. And this is a lot of the work that we do in grief counseling, both pre-bereavement and after death. But I want to talk about a few that I often talk about with clients. So the first is expression. Now, you just heard me go on a little rant about how we're all going to do this differently, right? The way you're going to grieve is different compared to you, and the way I need to get through this is going to be different than yours. But I want to put a little asterisk next to that because there is one thing that we universally do know about grief, and that is the only way you're going to get through grief is to grieve. Only way you're going to get through this journey. And by grieving, what I'm asking you to do is to connect to the grief. Be present with the grief and express the grief. So how do we do that? There's a lot of different options that we have, and I want to talk about a few of them. That top left is crying. Now, I want to spend a couple minutes just talking about crying because people will say, I feel like I'm not crying enough. I feel like I'm crying too much. There was a study done, and every time I do this presentation, I always forget to find this study because people are always interested in it. But there was a study done that they took actual tear samples and analyzed the samples, and they found there are actual toxins in our tears. So when we cry, we are physiologically releasing toxins and healing our body, which I think is so fascinating because we have a stigma to cry, but really, from a physiological standpoint, crying is actually really healthy. It helps heal your body. That being said, some of us are just not criers. Some of us just don't process our emotion through verbal or through crying and expressing tears. And that's okay. So I'm going to repeat it again for the people in the back of the room. It is okay if you are not crying all the time. It does not mean that you love your person any less. It does not mean that you are grieving any less. It does not mean that you are over this. Sometimes crying is just not how we express it. As long as you are finding a different way to express it. We can't just leave it in our toes. So what are some other ways we can express it? Through talking. We always express the importance of connecting, both connecting with people who know your loved one, who know all their nuances, who know the challenges, who get the struggles that you're going through to a certain extent, but then also connecting with other people, other grievers. Kind of like this whole conference that you guys are at. Right? That's the purpose of this, is to connect with other people who don't just say, I get it, but truly mean, I get it. Like, I totally get it. And there's a sense of community and a sense of collective grieving, which we think is really, really important. We noticed when COVID first hit, if anyone can remember, a lot of people, like a lot of funeral homes weren't allowing services, weren't allowing people to kind of gather. And we were seeing such a big impact that that was having on people grieving, kind of being stripped away from that sense of community to be around others who get it. And the same is true with anticipatory grief. I think there was a panel earlier this morning, and like I kind of overheard it a little bit, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. That's exactly what this community needs, is to connect with other people and hear their shared experiences. So talking, that's another way to express it. Journaling is a really great way to express it. There's so many thoughts and emotions going on in our head. It kind of reminds me of, if anyone's played bingo before, you know, that metal ball that all the ping pong balls are just bouncing off each other. That's what I think our thoughts feel like sometimes. So what journaling does is it allows us to take those thoughts out and place it on a piece of paper and give it a place to stay for a little bit. Music is another great way to connect with our loved ones and connect with our grief. There might be a song that helps you remember your loved one. There might be a song that helps you kind of connect to joy. Um, I'll share another brief story. I was working with someone who was feeling a lot of guilt about not crying. She's like, I feel like I need to cry. I know when I do cry, I feel the release, but I just can't get there. Like, I just can't get over that cusp to let the tears start flowing. So, what we did is we sat down and we had her come up with her cry playlist. So she came up with specific songs of these are the songs I'm going to play when I know I need to open the gates and let myself be totally present in these emotions and give myself permission to cry as much as I need to. And it really helped her in that moment, give her that permission to connect to the emotions when she needed to. And just really anything creatively can kind of help us tap into a different part of our brain, which goes into this next one, distraction. I like to think of grief as kind of this deep ocean, and when we're processing really the heart and soul of our grief, we're going down to the depths of that ocean where it's dark and it's cold, it's got a lot of pressure. All those like fish with the ugly teeth and light bulb eyes and all those ugly things live, right? That's where the grief work is. And we can hold our breath for a little bit, can take a breath, go down, but at some point, I have to come up for a breath of air. I have to. And that's what distraction does. Distraction allows us to come up, take a breath, and then go back into our journey. So this can look like a bunch of different things. Books, not educational books, not books about our illness, not books about grief, not books about teaching me something. I'm not saying to not do that, but in terms of distraction, that's not going to distract me. That's going to put me further into it, right? Let myself read leisure books, books that just help me step away for a little bit. Doing something creative, doing puzzles, doing crafts. What I love about that is it, like I said, it helps you kind of tap into a different piece of your brain, a different piece of you to kind of take a second to step away. Allowing yourself to listen to uplifting music, watching good shows and good movies. Don't laugh when I say this, the Hallmark Channel. Some of us, we either love Hallmark or we can't stand it. But I read somewhere because I've always found that fascinating. Like, why do we like Hallmark movies so much? Or I know for me, at home, I have The Office playing nonstop. I just love watching Office reruns. Why do we do that? And I read somewhere the reason that we're kind of inclined for those Hallmark movies and reruns is there's a sense of predictability. Every Hallmark movie I know, we're going to meet the characters, it's going to be some crisis, and then there's going to be a resolution at the end. Same with reruns. I don't have to be looking at the TV and I can tell you what's going on in that Office episode. I could probably say the lines. Not healthy, but I understand this. But that's for me. And there's a sense of predictability. And for so many parts of our grief journey, there are so many things out of our control, so many unknowns that we're talking about looking around the corner. And so where there's predictability, there's a sense of safety and comfort. So I always encourage people, watch the Seinfeld reruns, watch the Hallmark movies, help yourself connect to that sense of safety and predictability. A couple more things we're going to talk about. The idea of self-care. And really, I kind of switched that with compassion, self-compassion. And this is really just taking care of our overall mental, physical well-being. So that includes things like taking a time out and giving ourselves permission to have moments of solitude. And this can be challenging, especially as a caregiver, when we may not have as many opportunities to go get a massage or to take a nap. We might not have that option. But maybe what it looks like is when I pull into the driveway, I'm going to turn off the car, open the windows, and let myself have 30 seconds of feeling the breeze. When I'm taking a shower, I'm going to let the conditioner sit in my hair for an extra minute and just feel the water on myself. I'm going to let myself have these moments of solitude to really connect. Having the compassionate thoughts and really acknowledging this is hard. This is a really hard challenge, and I'm doing it. And some days are not easy, but some days I'm rocking it too. And acknowledging and validating what you are doing. Eating healthy foods that physically nourish us, also eating the not healthy foods, and letting ourselves really give ourselves that compassion through yummy foods and tend to that need. And really just pausing and taking a breath. There's something really important about that. And the last one is self-soothing. And so this encourages all the different 5 senses. So the more of these that you can include in one, the more you're able to really get a full experience of self-soothing. So we have sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing. So I just want you all to maybe take a moment and think about what are some of the sights that bring you comfort. Maybe it's a sunset. Maybe it's watching the snowflakes in a snow globe. For me, I'm a big Disney fan. You're learning a lot about me this morning. I'm a big Disney fan. So, like seeing the Disney castle, there's just something that's like even my wallpaper on my phone is me in front of the Disney castle. There's just something like, okay, take a breath. Touch, feeling our pets, fluffy pillows, fluffy blankets, hugging our loved one. There's something really powerful about the physical embrace of our loved ones. Different tastes. I don't know about you, but when I have my morning coffee, that first taste, that first sip, I'm always like, okay, I can take on the day. Just give me a second to taste the coffee. Smells, lotions, candles, and then hearing. So again, for me, what I love doing is listening to just YouTube songs in the background. Even when I was preparing for this presentation, I pulled up a playlist on like walking around the Disney park. So just kind of hearing the music ambiance. But those are things that I've learned throughout the years that help kind of calm me and give me a chance to just pause and really be present. So I encourage you to kind of think about these tools, think about how they can give you comfort and how they can really help you show yourself compassion through this grief journey. Now, I do just want to take a couple minutes and then we'll wrap things up to talk about how we can support our kiddos and our teens. So, like I said, I think there is this myth that we need to put on the armor. But what I really want you to remember is one of the healthiest things that we can do for our teens and our kids is to show them what healthy grief is. I'm sure we can all remember how grief was shown to us as kids. Maybe mom and dad had conversations without us in the room. Maybe they didn't let us go to the wakes. Or maybe they let us go up to the casket and actually say our wishes and kiss them goodbye. All those things influence how we're going to process our grief and how we're going to show our children how to grieve as well. So, one of the best things you can do for kiddos and teens is to really normalize their responses. And what's interesting is if you look at these responses crying, anxiety, irritability, grumpiness we feel these as adults too. These aren't only what kiddos feel and what teens feel. And so, what we want to do is be able to show them okay, when mom is sad, I cry because I miss them, or I'm really stressed. And when I'm stressed, I cry. And I'm going to have my burst of crying, but I'm also going to be able to stabilize and get back to my baseline. And that shows our teens and kiddos, okay, when mom's upset, she cries, but mom is also okay after she cries. And so if I feel upset, I need to cry. I guess that's okay for me to cry too, and I'll get through it too. It's about having those open lines of communication to really be transparent with each other. But here's a tricky thing, it's about having flexibility with limits at the same time, which I know kind of is backwards, doesn't really make a lot of sense. But it's the understanding that just like you're feeling so helpless in all of this, siblings might be feeling helpless in all of this as well, and your kiddos and teens. So trying to find ways to help them connect to any little piece of control that they can is really, really important. Having that sense of schedule and routines, right? We were just talking about how predictability creates safety. Same with teens and kiddos. Having those routines, having the knowns, I know what to expect, can create a sense of safety in maybe a chaotic world that they're experiencing. I also want to talk about the providing extra nurture and support. Where do our kids and our teens spend majority of their day usually during the year? At school, right? 8 is it 8-hour day, however many hours it is, right? That's a good chunk of their day. A good chunk of their community is really their school life. So we always encourage families to have that open line of communication with the school, even prior to the decline really progressing. Just having that so the social worker knows, for example, if Jane Doe is kind of really struggling to focus, there's stuff going on at home. And what's a cue that maybe John Doe can give the teacher, maybe it's raising her hand and saying fire hydrant, and that's the cue word of she needs to go have a minute to herself. She just needs to go to the bathroom or she needs to go to the social worker. But making sure our teens and our kids have that continued support throughout the entire day is really, really important. And then finally, these are just some other coping skills or coping ideas that we have for kiddos. So, like I said, encouraging them to be a part of the care, again, trying to figure out ways to have them be a part of it and not just an outsider. Now, of course, this is all developmentally charged, right? So we don't want our 3-year-old changing a diaper or something like that, right? We want to make sure it's developmentally appropriate for their age, but little things that they can do to help them feel that they are part of the community and helping their loved one, that they're a part of this, that they have some autonomy in this. Encouraging them to draw or paint their feelings. We know that teens a little bit more, but especially kiddos, they just don't express through words. One, they may not have the ability to, and two, they may not have like the full concept of how to express grief. So we want to create a way for them to express it through arts and crafts, is that's more in their alley of how they can express their needs to you. So giving them a chance to express in any way they can. And then this one talking about legacy projects again. So having things that they can be a part of the family through this process. Okay. These next two slides, I just have some suggested reading to learn more a little bit about anticipatory grief, about how to support people in the grief journey. And then the next slide has some online resources, so it can teach you a little bit more about legacy projects. StoryCorps is a really great website that talks about the importance of sharing your story. I'm sorry, sharing your story with others, and being able to say your loved one's name out loud and keep their impact and really process your own grief through this journey. So I want to thank you all for sitting tight with me. There was a lot of information I gave you, so I apologize. Does anyone have any questions? Otherwise, just know I'm here afterwards. No. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Have a great day, everyone.